All right, welcome back, Focus Learners, to another explainer. Today, we are unpacking a truly defining moment in modern history. We're going to be looking at a set of sweeping, detailed source notes that break down a massive historical earthquake, the Revolt of 1857. I mean, it's a wild question to think about, right? How exactly did the mighty British East India Company, which was this corporate behemoth with its own massive army, find itself on the brink of total collapse, nearly losing control of an entire subcontinent in just a matter of months? Okay, let's dive into this. Picture this. Over a span of 100 years, the East India Company had slowly, almost methodically, transformed from a simple trading entity into this sprawling political power. Our source notes highlight a really key shift here. India didn't just remain a market, it became an absolute necessity for the British government. Why? Well, because the sheer volume of raw materials and wealth extraction literally fueled the British Empire's global ambitions. The stakes were incredibly high. And that makes it all the more surprising that, initially, the British tried to control this vast, complex population with a shockingly small number of their own troops. It was a logistical nightmare that, as we'll see, would soon come back to haunt them. To really wrap our heads around this near catastrophe, we're going to follow a clear roadmap. We'll trace the road to 1857, dig into the roots of the revolt, hit that breaking point, look at interpreting the rebellion, and finally unpack the lasting impact. So, Part 1, the road to 1857, from local rebellions to a national crisis. You know, an event of this massive scale, it literally never just happens overnight. It was the boiling point of decades of friction. Ever since the company transformed into a political power, they faced pushback. As the source notes reveal, long before 1857, there were serious revolts at the local and regional levels. Peasants, tribals, and civil groups had all previously rebelled against various degrees of exploitation. The hollowness of the company's rule was already being exposed. It was really just waiting for a unifying spark. Which brings us to Part 2, Roots of the Revolts, the pressure cooker. Now, what's really interesting about this is how categorizing these roots helps us understand the sheer scale of the discontent. Think of Indian society at this time as a giant pressure cooker, with the heat being turned up from multiple different directions all at once. The notes break it down into 4 distinct pillars: social interference, economic destruction, political expansion, and military discrimination. Basically, society was being squeezed on absolutely every single front. Let's actually break down how this alienation played out. The British passed the Lex Loci Act in 1848, which tied property rights to religious conversion, something that completely terrified conservative Indians. They also interfered in traditional affairs by abolishing sati in 1829 and passing the Widow Remarriage Act in 1856. Politically, expansionist tools like the doctrine of lapse stripped traditional rajas and nawabs of their titles. And economically, the permanent settlement displaced the traditional zamindars. So every new policy seemed to alienate another crucial rung of society. Just imagine being a citizen where your religion, your local leaders, and your livelihood are all systematically dismantled at the exact same time. But the economic devastation? It went all the way to the absolute bottom. Look at this staggering number: 50 to 60%. Actually, wait, let me put that into perspective. The source notes emphasize that land revenue rates for peasants were sometimes pushed this high. Imagine handing over more than half of everything you grow just to survive. This wasn't just taxation, this was ruin. It led directly to widespread poverty, crippling famine, and rampant disease. The artisans lost their employment, migrating back to agriculture only to become landless laborers under these crushing rates. And that immense economic misery bled straight into the military. Our sources use this incredibly powerful phrase. They call the Indian soldier a peasant in uniform. The military didn't just revolt because of military factors. They revolted because they were deeply personally connected to the suffering of the peasantry. It was their own families starving under that 60% tax burden. Add to this the deep racial discrimination in salary and promotion, and the military was an absolute powder keg. Moving to Part 3, the breaking point, the spark that ignited the subcontinent. So with that pressure cooker fully sealed and the heat cranked up to high, all it took was one visceral catalyst to blow the lid completely off. That catalyst, as detailed in our source notes, was the introduction of the new Enfield rifle. Rumors spread like wildfire that the cartridges for this rifle were wrapped in the fat of cows and pigs. And because soldiers literally had to bite the cartridges to open them, this was deeply inauspicious and violently offensive to both Hindu and Muslim soldiers. For them, it was the ultimate literal interference in their faith. And this brilliantly illustrates how a single incident just snowballed. Things unraveled so fast. The very first sign of revolt came from Bengal, where a soldier of the 34th Native Infantry named Mangal Pandey attacked his commander, Lieutenant Bao. Pandey was subjected to a very quick trial and given the death penalty. This sparked massive, uncontrollable anger across various native infantries. Soon after, soldiers in Meerut and Bareilly revolted, and on May 10, 1857, they marched on Delhi. This march is marked as the formal beginning of the Great Rebellion. Part 4. Interpreting the Rebellion. Perspectives on a fractured event. Now, history is almost always shaped by whoever is holding the pen, right? The notes give us this really stark contrast in historiography. On one hand, Indian historians like V.D. Savarkar framed this event as the First War of Indian Independence. But on the other hand, British historians like Seeley downplayed it as merely a sepoy mutiny, patriotic and selfish. Others even called it a clash between civilization and barbarians or a Muslim conspiracy. It's the exact same historical event, but viewed through entirely opposing ideological lenses. So where do modern historians land on all this? Well, the notes clarify that modern historians point to a differentiality of factors, but a commonality of interest. What does that actually mean for us? It means the peasant, the displaced Nawab, the soldier, they all had totally different specific grievances, but they shared a common enemy. Their mutual anger at the East India Company united them, even if their ultimate goals weren't perfectly aligned. Finally, Part 5, the lasting impact. The Crown takes control. Let's move to and see how this builds into the aftermath. The rebellion was eventually suppressed, but the subcontinent was permanently altered. The British government realized, hey, we can no longer risk leaving India in the hands of a massive corporation. With the Government of India Act of 1858, the East India Company was officially abolished. The British Parliament took direct, formal control. The old Board of Control was replaced by an India House in London led by a Secretary of State. And on the ground, the title of Governor-General was upgraded to Viceroy, with Lord Canning being the very first to hold that new title. To try and pacify the population, Lord Canning read the Queen's Proclamation of 1858 aloud at Allahabad. And it sounded great on paper. It was filled with beautiful promises: no more territorial expansion, rolling back the despised doctrine of lapse, and a pledge of zero discrimination based on race, caste, or religion. But, and our source notes are quick to point this out, there was a massive gulf between these lofty announcements and the harsh reality on the ground. The reality was that discrimination absolutely continued, and Indians were still actively barred from higher administrative posts. Now, the most calculated changes? Those happened in the military. The British were absolutely terrified of another unified uprising, so they implemented a strict strategy of division. They literally divided soldiers into martial and non-martial categories. The groups that had remained loyal during the revolt, like the Sikh, Jat, and Gurkha soldiers, were labeled martial. They received strategic appointments and better service conditions. Conversely, soldiers from regions that had actively revolted, like Bihar, Bengal, and Awadh, were labeled non-martial and systematically denied basic facilities. This is absolutely crucial because it marks the true birth of a deliberate divide-and-conquer strategy that would deeply plague the subcontinent for the next century. They also drastically shifted troop demographics to dilute native power. In the northern heartland, which was the epicenter of the uprising, they forced a strict new ratio. For every 2 Indian soldiers, there would now be 1 British soldier. Meanwhile, down in southern India, that ratio shifted to 5 Indian soldiers to 2 British soldiers. And this was not accidental. It was a highly calculated, entirely structural change designed solely to ensure the British had enough boots on the ground to crush any future mutiny before it could spark. The overarching conclusion from our notes is that while the administrative names changed, the fundamental exploitative nature of colonial rule remained completely intact. Which really leaves us with a provocative question to wrap up this explainer. Our sources explicitly state that the changes after the revolt were only structural, not functional. The exploitation continued, just under new management. So we have to ask ourselves, did the Great Rebellion of 1857 ever truly end? Or did it just teach a battered subcontinent that the next phase of the struggle would require an entirely different kind of resistance? Think about that for a bit, and we'll see you in the next explainer.